Good morning. Let me start by thanking, on behalf of Philip Verkracht, my collaborator, and me, thanking our wonderful hosts at the at Jerusalem Institute of Israel Studies for having us here. I am honored to be addressing you today. My thanks go to Meir Kraus, Valerie Brachia, Tami Gavrieli, Galit Ras-Dror, and many other people who have been wonderful hosts to us so far today. Thank you. So, we live in consumer society. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that acquiring and maintaining material goods play a central role in our lives, in our leisure time, in social rituals, human interactions, in what we think about, what we do. I also mean another thing by it, and that is that the national economy greatly depends on, for its stability and well-being, on private consumption. Here is my first graph. I have to say I have limited time, so I will go very quickly through these graphs. But here shows you that in the US, about 71% of GDP comes from private consumption. Europe is somewhat lower, but also high. I'm not going to address China. That's another story. Right? We are all familiar with the ecological impacts of this material consumption, this insatiable demand for energy, materials, water that consumption generates. It's a hungry beast. Here is a very quick slide showing that as a result of it, over the years, we have already exceeded significantly the carrying capacity of the Earth. This is a global look. One is an estimate of the carrying capacity of Earth, and we are way above it, like 1.5 Earths and going strong. Some people, many people, politicians, policymakers, scientists, academics, municipality leaders look toward technology to solve this problem. They are focusing on resource efficiency and transition towards renewable energy resources. And to be sure, we really will need over the years all the ingenuity we can master in technological innovation to help us reduce the pressure on Earth that our consumption patterns create. But technology alone is not going to solve this problem. And there are numerous reasons why it's not going to solve this problem. For one thing, it requires huge investments, long time periods. The reductions are not likely to be large enough. Switching to renewable technologies, renewable energy technologies are still not solving the problem of soil erosion and water shortages and species decline and so on and so forth. And finally, producing solar panels and wind farms still requires a lot of materials and energy. We have to mine the minerals and so on. It doesn't come for free. And finally, we have a gift for whenever there is a technological innovations we find that reduces the energy impact, energy material impact of what we consume. We have a gift for finding new uses for it. So here, for example, LED lights, a wonderful invention, right? You can now buy a dress that is illuminated by these highly efficient LED lights. And we will never stop. We're very inventive species. Furthermore, here is another graph that shows you the size, the average size of the American home going up significantly. So what happens is the requirements for energy efficiency of homes are going up, but they are being outpaced by our demand for bigger, more luxurious, more bathrooms, more rooms, bigger size, right? So it is becoming increasingly clear that it's the demand side that absolutely must go down. Well, on the first blush, if I say that, it seems, how can we do it? This is an impossible task. And it's true that it's a very difficult task. For one thing, the idea of consuming less brings about the vision to people of sacrifice, reduced aspirations for our children, faltering economy, reversing progress, and so on. Politically, the idea of reducing consumption is a deeply subversive idea. If the economy and the political process and the major institutions depend on such massive consumption, it's clear that the national governments are facing a great dilemma, so they're not going to be the leaders in this transition. There are strong interests, very powerful interests out there that are interested in maintaining the status quo. So it is a very difficult task, but it's not an impossible task. And let's look very briefly at the history of how we arrived at what I call consumer society. And there are two things that are striking about it if you study the history of it. And I will focus on the history of it in the United States because the US basically invented, and if not invented, certainly perfected consumer society. So there are two things that the history of consumer society show very clearly. One of them is that it's a human construct. It's not some historical inevitability that we had to come to that place. It's been deliberately constructed through the collaborative efforts of the market, the industry, the government, and the labor unions. The second thing about consumer society is that it arose very rapidly, essentially in a single generation during the period of after Second World War. So here are a few slices that traces that history, okay? So during the war, there was a great effort on the part of US government to convince people to live frugally, not to spend money, not to consume, but instead to give to the war effort and buy, these are old posters from the period, buy government bonds. The campaign went so far as to, here is one poster that one of my students found in some historical archives, saying, if you don't share cars, you're driving with Hitler. I think it was an amazing slide. I praise the students for finding this slide. Right? All right. Now, the request for sacrifice from the government, for asking citizens to live in a thrifty way, came with a promise. And the promise was that after the war, after it's all over, this is the life we promise you. And these are all also original posters from the period of Second World War. Right? And when the war ended, that's exactly what happened. There was this enormous industrial overcapacity that shifted towards civilian production, and tax policies of the government encouraged the development of suburbs. This is your dream house. In fact, suburbs in the US were invented, and the first totally planned suburb was built in 1953. It was called Levittown. So the whole thing was a construct. Federal government used taxpayer money to build the infrastructure to push for these suburbs. And the labor unions, rather than trying to fight for higher wages and, let's say, longer vacations, in the US, only focused on higher wages and greater spending capacity. This is where Europe and the US diverted. Europe went for longer vacation times. The US went for more income, more purchasing power. All right? So the result, and here is a comment from Consumer Journal by one of the analysts of this. This was really a plan. The way he says that is, we need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at ever-increasing rate. This was the vision. What did this vision create? Essentially, in a course of a single generation of about 20 years, the United States most people moved from cities into suburbs, and the very idea of what is good life and what it means to be American and what it means to be a democratic society, what it means to be a happy family, change very rapidly, and this is what we created. This is the happy family, this is the well-being, and this is what it looks like from far away. Okay, so we created this consumer society, we created the suburbs. What has it brought us since in the last 50 or 60 years? Well, it brought us, certainly it brought us a lot of malls. It brought us, first of all, it brought us great prosperity. There is no doubt that the prosperity has increased. Even the face of poverty today in the US is different than it was 60, 70 years ago. It's still, even poverty has a car and a TV and running water and so on. But it also brought us, okay, so this is, all right, this is more of the American dream. This was the American dream, 1950. If you go on the web and type a dream house in America, this is what you're going to get. All right? So the road is in one direction, more, bigger, and more luxurious. All right? And this is more of what consumer society looks like. Okay. What it brought us also is very long working hours. Here is a graph that traces working hour per year in different countries, and you see on the top is the US, and on the bottom is the Netherlands and Germany, right? So we work very long hours. What about the well-being? Well, this is what we find is, here is a graph that shows the growth of GDP, which has been really increasing since 1970. But the lower graph is a composite showing various social problems, like teenage pregnancy, crime, social trust, health, and so on. When you put them together, you see that the consumer society, since about 1970, actually, while the economy has been growing, the social well-being has actually not been increasing at all. Right? Here is another graph that shows subjective well-being. People are asked in survey, are you happy? Do you feel satisfied with your life? And what you see here, that while the GDP has been going up, the answer, the percent of people who said, I'm very happy, actually has been pretty flat. Right? That's a subjective view of well-being. So in short, it has become, here is very quick one. Even in China today, you can see they ask people, are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? And you can see that the top earners, the rich people in China, say, okay, we know better, we know worse than we were before in terms of happiness. But the other two groups of income are actually going down, while the economy, of course, is booming. So it is becoming very clear that we need to focus on growing human well-being rather than focus on growing the economy. Now, what do I mean? Okay, I'm sorry, I skipped. Okay, let me Another thing that consumer society brought us is tremendous income inequalities. Here is the boutique shopping malls. This line is a line to Walmart. You probably all heard about Walmart. On a day that they announced a big sale on electronics. People were lining up at 5 in the morning. There was actually somebody was actually once trampled to death when they opened the door. So this is, and the income inequality is actually a very high price we pay, because here is, I show you here a graph that shows index of various social problems as a function of income inequality, and you see the striking dependence between the two, with the US being at the very top. That's what we have to show for. So in a way, you could think you could solve a lot of problems without growing GDP by simply reducing income inequality. Okay, so it is becoming clear that we need to focus on well-being rather than growing economy. And here I distinguish between objective and subjective. So objective well-being are these indicators of societal health that I showed you a moment ago. But the subjective well-being is a sense a person has of having a satisfying life and having a satisfying and meaningful life. And from now on, the rest of my remarks, I want to focus on subjective well-being, not the objective one. Why do I want to do that? And the reason is this. People are not going to give up their consumerist lifestyles out of concern for the environment or out of good citizenship. Some people will, most people won't. But they may do so if they find other ways of finding meaning in life and satisfaction from life, essentially a sense of well-being. So I would like to focus on that. So what do we know about human well-being, this subjective well-being, that sense of I'm okay and my family is okay? Well, there has been a lot of research done, and I just want to highlight 4 points from this research that are relevant to this discussion here. Interestingly, the research that has been done all around the world, and the answers are all the same, whether you research it in Afghanistan or in Japan or in the US. Essentially, what people need to feel good about themselves and their lives is more or less the same everywhere. All right? So, 1, we need family, meaningful work, health, access to natural environment, leisure time. 2, we need to feel part of a community, to feel respected, recognized, be able to trust others. 3, we are deeply social beings. We measure our success in life and in relation to other people. We look at others to see where we stand. And we compete. And this is where the great marketing machinery brilliantly took advantage of that human quality by convincing us that we can outdo others and have a higher standing in a community by having more material goods and displaying them. The bigger, the more. Right? And the 4th point about human well-being is that we very quickly get used to new things. So the thrill of acquiring something you've been wanting to have very quickly wears out, and you are no happier with it than you were without it, which creates, of course, the treadmill. Want, work, earn, spend, want, etc., etc. So if you put it all together, these basic human qualities, you can see that we essentially are in a consumer arms race. It's insatiable, it has no end, And it doesn't necessarily, once the essential needs are satisfied, doesn't necessarily lead to greater well-being. Okay, so knowing what we know about the diminishing returns on well-being through consumption, the question is there any possibility that we could move beyond this massive consumption? And I don't know what the answer is. I will tell you some indications from the US that say that maybe there is a cultural shift. So for one thing, surveys show that most Americans think we consume too much. And what's interesting, 85% in that particular survey. It didn't cover the whole country. There are some limitations, but it's a set of data. What's interesting about this survey is that people who said that, it was totally not related to their political views, right-wing, left-wing, and it was not related to their belief whether climate is changing or not. It was just a general feeling, people saying the country would be better off if we consumed less. 2, economic growth. Economic growth in mature economies like the US and Europe is slowing down, and it's going to be slow. Right? The days of the rapid growth during the 60s and 70s and 80s are over. If we get economic growth, it's going to be very, very slow. And it affects especially the millennial generation. The millennial generation, somewhere at the age of between 18, 19, and mid-30s, are anticipating, they know it already, and everybody else knows it, that their economic opportunities are not going to be as big as their parents. So they will have to adapt to a smaller lifestyle. Another thing about millennials, though, that may be what I just said negative, but there is something very interesting happening among the millennials, especially in the US context. About 70% of them, when surveys, say they don't want to live in the suburbs. This idea of a perfect life in a sprawl out there, far away from the cities, doesn't appeal to them at all. And here is, okay, so I skipped that. All right, here is the home ownership in the US, which in the last few years has been rapidly going down, and that partly reflects the millennials, the young generation. But here is, so they are interested in cities. Here is probably a very significant graph, and that shows that driver's licenses are going down. Now, in the US, getting a driver's license at age 16 and a half has been always the rite of passage. My children, the day that they turned 16 and a half, we had to go and take the test. This was the way of life. And you can see that increasingly young people don't have an interest in having a driver's license and in driving a car. And the most important thing is that they are moving to the cities. Now, what about the cities? One thing about the cities is that life in a city, in the center of the city, is expensive, and the apartments are expensive, and they're small. So there is less leftover income for spending on stuff, and less room to store all that stuff. So, and finally, when your economic constraints are greater, there is a greater need for mutual reciprocity, depending on each other, interdependency, living in a way that people help each other. So the way I see it is that it is possible that through this new way, the new lifestyles that the city are bringing to the young generation, a new framing of well-being is going to emerge. Well-being based less on material consumption and more on other aspects of life that create well-being. Now, city governments, municipalities generally, have a great power to turn this possibility, because all I say is at this point is possibility, to turn it into an opportunity. Of course, there is much more expertise in this room about urban development and making sustainable cities than I have, so I will leave much of it to the rest of the day, to the speaker the rest of the day. Let me just say that the essential step in all of it is to frame all the urban initiatives in terms of maximizing human well-being, especially for young families. It's making sure that they have access to affordable housing, access to good education, and everything needs to be built around. Question has to be asked, does it build a community? Does it build a type of community that increases well-being? And the projects also have to be looked at from multiple angles. So there are people who are pushing, environmental people who are pushing for very high performance buildings, right? Energy performing buildings. But one needs to look at the building not only as an artifact that consumes energy, but also a place that can create community and where there is access to open space, natural environment that creates a sense of well-being. Right. So, in short, I leave all the great ideas to you, how to implement it, and all I can say at this point that we hope that this iconic shopping cart will one day become a very interesting museal object. And this is also a little bit of self-promotion. This is a book that we co-authored. Thank you very much.